September 1, 1939. Before sunrise. Poland. Europe was still asleep. In the small Polish town of Wieluń, streets were quiet. Hospitals were treating patients. Families were inside their homes. There was no battlefield in sight. Then in the darkness above them aircraft appeared. The world was about to enter a war unlike anything it had ever seen. Germany had launched its invasion of Poland, an attack that would trigger World War II in Europe. German forces were moving across the border, while the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, prepared to strike targets throughout Poland. And among the aircraft heading toward Polish territory were some of the most important warplanes of the coming conflict. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, the Heinkel He 111, the Dornier Do 17. These aircraft would become famous, or infamous, across Europe. But on that morning they were simply machines carrying the first waves of a new air war. The traditional story says World War II began at 4:45 a.m., when the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish military depot at Westerplatte. The German invasion itself began at dawn on September 1st. But there is an important complication. German aircraft were already attacking Polish targets around the same time. At Wieluń, Polish sources and historical commemorations place the beginning of the Luftwaffe bombing at approximately 4:40 a.m., before the famous bombardment of Westerplatte. The exact timing has been debated by historians, so it is safer to say that the air attacks occurred in the opening moments of the invasion rather than claim one aircraft can be definitively identified as the first. What is not disputed is what came next. The Luftwaffe began striking Poland on a massive scale. The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum describes the Luftwaffe's bombers as conducting the first air strikes of the war on September 1, 1939. And Wieluń became one of the darkest symbols of those opening attacks. The town was hit by German dive bombers including Ju-87 Stukas. Buildings were destroyed. Fire spread. A hospital was among the places struck and civilians were killed. Poland's Institute of National Remembrance records extensive destruction in the town and identifies the Ju-87 as the aircraft used in the attack. For the people below, the sound of aircraft meant something terrifying. The age of modern air warfare had arrived. And the aircraft overhead were only the beginning. Because behind them came thousands of soldiers, tanks, artillery pieces, and an entire military machine designed to move faster than its opponents could react. Within hours, the skies over Poland would become crowded with German aircraft. And the world would discover just how devastating air power could be. The Luftwaffe did not enter Poland as an improvised force. Germany had spent years rebuilding its military aviation capability after the restrictions imposed following the First World War. By 1939, the Luftwaffe had developed a force capable of supporting a large-scale ground invasion. Its aircraft were designed for different roles. The Heinkel He 111 was a medium bomber capable of carrying substantial bomb loads over considerable distances. The Dornier Do 17, originally known for its slender appearance, had evolved into a fast medium bomber. And then there was the aircraft that would become one of the defining symbols of German air power, the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. The Stuka was a specialized dive bomber. Instead of simply releasing bombs from level flight, its pilots could put the aircraft into a steep dive toward a target, allowing them to aim directly before releasing the bomb. The aircraft even carried sirens on some early versions, producing the famous screaming sound associated with the Stuka. But the terrifying sound came later in popular memory. On September 1, 1939, what mattered was accuracy, coordination, and surprise. The German invasion combined aircraft with rapidly advancing ground forces. The aim was not simply to destroy Polish cities. Luftwaffe units were also tasked with attacking communications, transport networks, military positions and airfields while supporting German armies advancing across the country. The invasion demonstrated Germany's ability to combine air power with armored forces in a highly mobile campaign. Poland was badly outmatched in numbers and equipment. The German invasion force included nearly 900 bombers and more than 400 fighter aircraft, alongside more than 2,000 tanks and approximately 1.5 million troops. Poland had only a little over 300 aircraft available, according to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. But the Polish Air Force was not simply sitting helplessly on the ground waiting to be destroyed. Polish planners had dispersed many aircraft to concealed operational airfields before the invasion, making it harder for Germany to destroy the entire force in one strike. Polish pilots fought back. Among them was the Ladislaw Jimas, who would become famous for shooting down 2 German Dornier bombers on September 1, becoming one of the first Polish pilots credited with aerial victories of the war. Meanwhile, German aircraft continued attacking across the country. At Wieluń, the devastation was severe. The town's hospital was hit, and large parts of the town were destroyed. Poland's Institute of National Remembrance records that approximately 80% of the town's infrastructure was destroyed, including hundreds of residential and public buildings. The attack became a symbol of the destructive potential of aerial bombing against populated areas. And that was one of the most important lessons of September 1939. Aircraft no longer needed to wait for armies to meet on a battlefield. A war could arrive from the sky. A person could wake up in a town hundreds of kilometers from the front and suddenly hear aircraft overhead. There might be no warning. No visible enemy soldiers. Just engines. Then bombs. As German armies advanced, the Luftwaffe continued supporting the campaign. Polish defenses were overwhelmed by the combination of German air power, armored formations, artillery and mobile infantry. German forces advanced rapidly toward Warsaw, while Polish troops fought determined resistance in many areas. And yet, the campaign was not the effortless victory that later mythology sometimes suggested. German forces suffered significant resistance and casualties. Polish soldiers continued fighting. Polish pilots continued flying. But the strategic imbalance was enormous. By September 3, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The conflict that had begun with the invasion of Poland was no longer simply a German-Polish war. Europe was now at war. And above it all, aircraft were becoming one of the most important weapons of the new conflict. The aircraft that crossed Poland's skies in September 1939 were not yet the legendary machines of the Battle of Britain, the Eastern Front or the bombing campaigns over Germany. But they were the beginning. The first chapter. And the world was about to learn what happened when modern industry, aviation and total war were combined. The question sounds simple. What was the first aircraft to take part in World War II? But history rarely gives us an answer that simple. There was no single aircraft that historians can universally identify as the first plane of World War II. Instead, several German aircraft were involved in the opening air operations of the invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939. Bombers, dive bombers, fighters, reconnaissance aircraft. They crossed Polish skies as Germany launched its attack. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka became particularly associated with the opening campaign because of its role in attacks such as the bombing of Wieluń. The Heinkel He 111 and Dornier Do 17 were also important Luftwaffe bombers during the campaign. And that distinction matters. Because the story isn't really about finding one aircraft and declaring it the winner of a historical race. It's about understanding what those aircraft represented. On September 1, 1939, the airplane changed from a weapon of limited battlefield support into a central instrument of modern warfare. The Luftwaffe demonstrated how aircraft could operate alongside rapidly advancing ground forces. Germany's campaign in Poland showed the destructive potential of coordinating air power, armor and mobile troops. But there was another side to the story. For the people beneath those aircraft, this wasn't military theory. It was real. It was the sound of engines approaching. It was buildings shaking. It was smoke rising above familiar streets. It was hospitals and homes being destroyed. It was the realization that a war could come from thousands of feet above the ground. Wieluń became one of the earliest and most tragic examples of this new reality. The first bombs fell there in the early morning of September 1, according to Polish historical records, and the town suffered enormous destruction. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Poland, German troops crossed the frontier, artillery opened fire and the battles of the campaign began. At Westerplatte, Polish defenders resisted German attacks. In the skies, Polish pilots challenged the Luftwaffe. Across the countryside, armies began moving toward one another. And by September 3, Britain and France had entered the conflict. The war was no longer confined to Poland. It would eventually consume Europe, then spread across North Africa, Asia and the Pacific. Millions would die. Cities would disappear. And aircraft would evolve from piston-engine bombers and fighters into machines capable of crossing oceans, carrying radar, dropping enormous bomb loads and eventually breaking the sound barrier. But every one of those developments belongs to a later chapter. The story began here. In the early morning darkness of September 1, 1939. With aircraft moving across the Polish sky. So if someone asks you, what was the first aircraft of World War II? The most historically responsible answer isn't simply the Stuka. It is this. The first air strikes of the European war were carried out by German Luftwaffe aircraft during the invasion of Poland, and among the aircraft involved were the Ju-87 Stuka, Heinkel He 111 and Dornier Do 17. No single aircraft can safely be crowned the definitive first. But those aircraft were among the first machines to carry the new war into the sky. And once they did, there was no going back.